see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Dee Reynolds, who is a professor of French at the University of Manchester and is on the project team of the Watching Dance Kinesthetic Empathy project. So thank you, Dee, for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so the reason we're connecting here and talking is that you are on your project member, the Kinesthetic Empathy Project, which has a website at watchingdance.org. Mm-hmm. And I can actually show that here on the screen for a second. And then there's the project has a website, and you put on a conference, as well as you have a book called Kinesthetic Empathy in Creative and Cultural Practices, and I happen to have a copy here. Wonderful book. And so what we wanted to do in this dialogue was talk about your project kind of in general, kind of get an overview of what the project was about, and maybe look at some pages on your website, as well as get a bit of an overview of some of the chapters of the book, which you edited or co-edited. And then also, I think here we had maybe talk about the relationship of art and science in this collaboration. So we've got a full schedule here for the next hour. So yeah, if you'd like to maybe just start, if there add anything to the intro, and just maybe start about your project and how it came about and what it's all about.
Okay. Well, it started out working in the field of dance because I was doing my research on dance, and I heard a program on the radio one day by chance where they were talking about what could be done to find out about events in the brain. And it struck me that it might be possible to work out what was actually going on in the brains of people who were watching dance. And because I'm not a dancer myself, but I'm really interested in dance as an art form, this was of great interest to me. And so I got in touch with the person who'd been speaking on the radio program, and he invited me to meet him, and I met his team, and we did work out that there would be some really interesting ways of looking at what people are experiencing while they're watching dance. So while in the past, people working in the arts and humanities had engaged in speculation, often using various theories like psychoanalysis or other theories to think about what people might be experiencing when they're watching a performance or looking at an artwork, this seemed like it was possible to use scientific methods to see what was actually going on in the brain. And I was interested in trying to put those things together, those two discourses in science and in the arts and humanities, to see if there were any connections.
Okay,
so that was where it all began.
So you just heard about some work that was being done around empathy and dance and science, and you wanted to bring the scientists and the artists together to kind of explore this.
Yes. And in the beginning, it was, I suppose the idea about empathy came to me from my work on art and on dance. And it was really about the relationship between the observer and the art object. And when I started off looking at the connections with science, I didn't know that there was a lot of research being done on what are called mirror neurons. But when I found out about that, I realized that there was even more reason to try to bring the two together, because there seemed to be important parallels. But I also, the radio program I heard was in fact about, it wasn't about brain scanning, which is what mirror neurons are usually associated with, but it was about another technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And this is something where you can investigate the neurophysiological response when people are sitting up. And this seemed to me to be very important, because when you have a brain scan, you obviously have to lie down in the scanner. I don't know whether you've ever done that, but I have for medical reasons. And I didn't think I would mind it too much, but actually it's really claustrophobic, and sometimes you have to stay in there for a long time. And I think because our response to art, I think, is very embodied, that if you're responding to something while you're lying down in a scanner in a small claustrophobic space, you are not really going to be having the same kind of experience that you would if you were watching something standing or sitting in a more normal way. So I was very interested by this other technique, which meant that people didn't have to go inside a scanner. And luckily, one of the people in the team that I went to see in London was, in fact, herself a trained Indian dancer. She's trained in Bharatanatyam, which is a classical Indian dance form. And she was also a scientist. So that's where we started. I was working with her, and we did a pilot study before we started on the main project.
Yeah, I see an Indian dancer on your homepage here.
Yes, that's right. That's her. Yes, Anna Kapurvi. Yes.
And well, you have quite a bit of material on your website. So you've really, this is what's been a 3-year project to just explore this topic.
Yeah, that's right. Well, it started, the funded project began in 2008. But before that, we'd already started doing some of the work. So with Anna, we'd done a pilot study to see whether this technique was able to pick up the kinds of things we wanted to explore, and we found that it did. And the funding period ended in 2011, in March 2011, so it's just over a year ago now. But we produced so much research during the 3 years that we still have material to work on. So we haven't finished yet exploring all the implications of what we did.
So to give kind of like an overview of all the different projects, like you had a conference, and what's kind of all the things on your website? Because like you did say, there's an awful lot there that you did. Kind of, you could give an overview of all the things you did.
Yeah, well, some of it was very practical, really, because we were we had to devise experiments which helped us to find answers to some of the questions that we were asking. And we were working on the one hand with dancers, choreographers, with qualitative methods, and on the other hand, we were working with cognitive science. So it was quite difficult to, to work out how we could go about doing this. So some of what's on the website is about those studies and how they were done. So, for example, there was one where we looked at ballet and we looked at Bharatanatyam, and Anna did the Bharatanatyam dancing. So on the website, you can see the pictures of Anna dancing. We also have videos up there. And for the same project, we had some ballet dancing, and we were comparing responses to the ballet and the Bharatanatyam. So you can see both dancers on the website. We also did some work with a choreographer called Rosie Kay, and she made a piece specially for the project. And again, you can see that on the website, and there's a video of the piece. We were particularly interested in that piece in exploring the relationship between soundscapes and movement, and how people's experience of movement changes according to the soundscape that they are experiencing at the same time. So we asked Rosie to choreograph a piece specially for us, which would use some of the same movement sequences, but would have different soundscapes associated with it. So she had, some of it was using music by Bach, some of it was using electroacoustic music. And interestingly, she also had a phase where there weren't any external sounds, but the sounds of the dancer's body were very audible. So it was like the sound of the dancers when they landed heavily on the floor, and also the sound of the dancers breathing. And we deliberately wanted to emphasize those sounds. They weren't overlaid. It wasn't a soundtrack overlaid on the movement. It was actually the sounds the dancers produced as they were dancing.
So kind of overview then is you're wanting to kind of explore the nature of empathy in movement, kind of in a broad sense, like, how does it work, kind of understand it, and kind of and bring together dancers to kind of experiment, as well as the scientists to have this dialogue. And it's really about really kind of understanding, kind of an exploration about the nature of empathy and how it works. And
yes, yes, in a very embodied way. And what happens in terms of like transmission from body to body when people are watching dancers on stage. So it's really looking at using the neuroscience to see what is happening neurophysiologically, but then using qualitative audience research where we had interviews and focus groups to see what people consciously experience and how they articulate what they experience. And from that point of view, because we're very aware that language is, you know, a specific way of communicating things that doesn't necessarily encompass everything. And often people, when they're talking about dance, they're lost for words and they say, I can't express this, you know, I don't know how to put this into words. So we're very aware that language is just one way of expressing things. So we have also experimented with using other modes of expression, in particular visual arts. So one of the project members, Matthew Reason, who's a qualitative audience researcher, who's experienced in the use of visual methods, he did a visual arts workshop where we got people to respond to dance through drawing pictures, and then we got them to talk about the pictures that they'd drawn. So we found that was a very interesting way of getting people to really engage with their own embodied responses in a way that they wouldn't necessarily do if they hadn't had to produce the pictures, because doing the pictures actually made them more aware of their own embodied responses to the dance, and different things came out, like about the texture of movement, or, you know, what aspects of movement might suggest different colors or different kinds of lines. So it produced quite a different sort of discourse. So it's really about this interconnection, this embodied transmission and interconnection that we can describe in terms of empathy. But empathy and kinesthetic empathy are obviously quite problematic terms because they mean different things to different people.
Well, what are the terms? What do they mean to different people? What have you kind of come up with? Like, how are people kind of using those terms, and kind of what does it mean to you personally?
Well, I think the putting together kinesthesia and empathy is really about putting together a certain idea of motor resonance. So kinesthesia is like a sensation of movement. How do we experience movement sensations? And we experience movement sensations all the time, but a lot of the time we don't think about them. But everybody does, you know, it's common to, you know, everyday experience. It's nothing to do with dance particularly. But in dance, we can become more aware of those movement sensations. And in terms of empathy, we're thinking about how the dancer's movement, so the movement that the spectator is watching, how they might be able to experience that in their own bodies through a kind of motor resonance. So the empathy is partly in the transmission of that resonance. So when I'm watching, say, a dancer doing a great leap, you know, what do I experience in my body that in some way resonates with that leap that I'm seeing? So there is then a kind of a shared dynamism between me and the dancer. But that's not to say that I am necessarily experiencing the same thing as them, because they are different from me. So we're not trying to create a kind of false unity between the two, but simply to talk about a kind of resonance or transmission that happens. And then the empathy can also involve a certain emotional response, but that is more variable, and that really depends very much on the context, like the context of the dance. Some dances have narrative, they have a story, you know, like certain ballets are, you know, like Giselle is very tragic, and the dance itself will produce certain emotions. But also spectators bring their own emotional baggage and their own cultural competences and experiences, so they bring their own emotions. So, for example, one person I interviewed about a ballet ended up telling me about how it reminded him of bringing his daughter to ballet lessons when she was small, and that was the kind of emotional baggage that he had associated with the ballet. So it does vary very much according to the context of what spectators bring with them.
So you're kind of like exploring that, like what are the spectators experiencing? Kind of what's their experience, their existing experience? How does that relate? How do different types of dance affect
Yes,
people
exactly.
differently? A different
Yeah.
medium? How do you kind of engage in that? I actually do kind of a dance, ongoing dance myself. So I do kind of
Oh,
like a
really?
freestyle type dance here in Berkeley, near where
Yeah.
I live, and also do contact improv. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's
Yes,
as
I
a
am. Yeah, yeah.
type of dance. So, so
Yes, that's very interesting.
yeah, so this really kind of resonates with me, and a lot of my emotional exploration takes place kind of on the dance floor,
Yes.
and uh, and I've done dances where I really try to mirror someone else, kind of
Mm-hmm.
see. And I've had real interesting experiences by, uh, well, once I could just tell this quick story. Is I did a workshop which was a very empathic kind of workshop. So I got a lot of empathy. A lot of people were empathizing with me, and I really felt seen, heard, and
Mm-hmm.
felt to myself. And I found that it kind of deepened my sense of grounding and in myself, a centering. And then when I went to the dance the next day, I said, "Oh, I really want to hear what you have to say." I didn't say
Yeah.
it, but I just said it emotionally. And I want to hear what you have to say, and I want to reflect what I'm hearing until I totally get you,
Yeah.
in a movement level. So I would start mirroring people, and sometimes they'd be going so fast, I couldn't keep up. And then they would see that I'm trying to mirror them, and they'd kind of slow down, let me kind of catch up and kind of get into the groove. And then there
Yes.
was it seemed like there would be a point that happens where in this mirroring, we'd kind of click
Yeah.
into gear almost.
Uh-huh.
And then it's at that point we're almost like moving as one body, and
Yes.
the dance would unfold, that they would offer an energy, and I would take that energy and play with it creatively, add something to it, and back and forth. And it was a very resonant, harmonious exploration type of dance. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the kind of thing, really, and as you're describing it, that is something that comes about through movement. It comes about through a connection that starts in movement and through the body, and it doesn't start with shared ideas, or it's not a cognitive thing. That's not to say it can't turn into something cognitive, but that's not how it starts. It starts in a different way based on different kinds of signals. So that's exactly it, really. And obviously, if you go to see a dance as a spectator, you may not move, much or at all. Sometimes in the Western cultural tradition, it's not really done. You're supposed to stay still in your seat. So it's also very much about the idea of virtual movement. Even if you don't actually move about, is there something that happens inside you that is nonetheless a kind of mirroring of the kind that you're talking about?
yeah, and that's kind of mirroring happening through mirror neurons. And I just saw you kind of move your hands kind of like this. So as you were doing it, I could feel I'm sitting here still. Um, I'm I'm sitting here. Oh, you were doing this kind of movement like this. I'm
Yeah.
sitting here still, and I can kind of feel that inside of myself as if I'm kind of doing that movement,
Yes.
and that's kind of more like the Western way or typical dance. Everybody just sitting and watching, and they're kind of feeling it kind of mirrored and resonating within themselves.
Yes. Yes.
So you could
Yeah.
kind of do experiments where the whole audience would try to mirror the dance and see kind of, for example, I
Yeah.
imagine would be something, So it's these type of
Yeah.
explorations that you're doing to see what the
Yeah.
nature
Yeah.
are. Uh-huh.
Yes, I mean, because the mirror neuron research, which, as I say, I didn't know about when I first started this, is really to do with the connections between seeing and doing, and the idea that seeing and doing are not completely not completely distinct. It's more like a continuum.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a similar type of activity when you see something and connect with it. I mean, you can see something and not connect with it, and then there won't be any effect. But if you see something and you kinesthetically engage with it, then you are doing something that is qualitatively similar to actually doing it. So that's really the connecting point between the science and the more sort of art humanities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the empathy for me is really a unifying kind of a connection between the arts and sciences, that they seem to be really, it seems to be a real intersection there between the two. I think it was V.S. Ramachandran, who's a neuroscientist in Los Angeles. I saw a presentation he gave, and he showed a handshake between humanities and science around empathy, because he saw
Oh
it.
yeah, that's good. Yeah, yeah.
Because it kind of shows, it connects that internal world with the understanding scientific, you know, how things are really working. So it's a wonderful topic and to kind of explore. But it sounds like you were kind of exploring it more for like, well, how does this work? You know, what happens when we do this? What happens when that happens? And bringing a wide variety of people together to kind of talk about it. I'm looking at kind of an aspect of how do we build a culture of empathy.
Yeah.
To say, well, we really need more empathy in society and need to raise the level of empathy within society because it has so many positive aspects. Is that anything? Did you look at that kind of aspect?
Well, the immediate research that we were funded for was specifically about audiences looking at dance. But when we had our conference, which was in 2010, it was really exciting to find how many people out there were interested in the idea of kinesthetic empathy, and you know what different fields people were coming from. So at the conference, we had people coming from a big variety of backgrounds, and quite a lot of people working in various sorts of embodied therapy areas. So that's something that, you know, we then wanted to go ahead and explore further. So one aspect of that is, you know, we were looking at the effects of watching dance and how that might stimulate people's kinesthetic empathy, and that was in terms of the effects of watching dance. But something that comes out of that is, well, how might that have a wider implication? So if watching people move in certain ways, or watching people connect in certain ways, sensitizes people to empathy and stimulates their empathic reactions, that may be something that can be mobilized in different contexts. So at the moment, I'm looking at possibilities of using this in other ways. For example, in the case of patients like dementia patients or other people who have difficulty with verbal communication for one reason or another, the people who are caring for them obviously have a communication issue because they can't communicate with them in the ways that we normally would, and therefore we're looking at how this research might be relevant to facilitating communication in non-verbal ways, which would be helpful to people looking after, for example, dementia patients.
So in that case, it's like people with dementia would have maybe difficulty with the verbalizing, but they could still connect through a mirroring of each other in some way, for example. Is that?
Yeah, it's also about whether people can be sensitized to communicating with others through a motor resonance rather than directly verbally. So even when you don't have a verbal connection with somebody, when you can't have a verbal conversation with them, how might one communicate through the body? How can people become more aware of how people are expressing themselves through the body when verbal communication isn't there? Those are the kinds of questions that come up.
How do you see this progressing? I mean, you had a grant and you brought all these people together and had the conference, and where are you seeing things going in the future?
Well, at the moment, there's a lot of different things that are sort of going ahead on different fronts. There's the choreographer who worked with us on this project, Rosie Kay. She found that what she learned through the audience research with us about audience responses based on kinesthetic empathy, particularly their embodied responses to the soundscape, the breathing, those things, they have impacted on her practice as a choreographer. So that's one way it's going forward, is through working with choreographers, and how what they find out about audience responses, how that can influence the way that they make work. So Rosie Kay is one example, but we're also working with choreographers here in Manchester, where I live, and we've got quite a lot of new activity here around audience interaction with dance, which wasn't there before. We have another grant application going in for that, which is probably going in today or tomorrow, so fingers crossed for that. And then there's also the initiative I just mentioned about dementia patients, so I'm taking that forward with a couple of people who attended the conference, who are working in those embodied areas that I mentioned. So one of them is a dance movement therapist, the other works with dance movement therapy, but she's also a filmmaker, so filmmaking will be part of the new project if we have that funded. And we're also working with one of the neuroscientists who was on the original project for that. And then there are a lot of things happening at the moment around the area of cognitive science and dance. So, for example, I'm going to a conference in Bremen in September being held on that topic. So I'll be taking that forward in the context of what they're doing. In Kent in the UK, this is one of the links on our website. There is a centre run by one of the contributors to our book, Nicola Shaughnessy, and they're also looking at kinesthesia and empathy. There seem to be an awful lot of things going on at the moment, so I feel that in a way we were kind of on the crest of a wave, and there's a lot of activity in that area now.
Yeah, and in terms of, your 3 or 4 years of exploring this, what did you really learn that really kind of stands out for you personally? Was there any aha moments or?
Yeah, well, one of the things we wanted to find out was whether exposure to watching, so like visual experience of watching movement, whether that impacts on how people respond to movement, in our case specifically dance movement. And that did turn out to be the case. We found that with ballet spectators who had been used to watching quite a lot of ballet, that their responses were shown both through the science and through the qualitative research. They were shown to be, I suppose you might say, more intense, stronger than people who were less visually experienced in watching that form of dance. So that was really interesting, because that was one of the things that we specifically set out to explore at the beginning. And we also found through the same study that that people's levels of empathy, when they go in, as it were, their sort of their characteristics, their empathic characteristics that they have, those also have an influence on how they experience dance. And we found that particularly in relation to the Bharatanatyam, which is quite a narrative form. I mentioned that's the Indian classical dance, and it's often based on storytelling. So there's a narrative element there. And people who have got strong empathic tendencies appear to respond quite strongly to that sort of narrative, in terms of being able to transpose themselves fictionally into characters. So that was another important outcome for us. And then also a thing that is particularly useful in terms of dance research is the embodied response, that we found that spectators appear to have, I'm being cautious here, because obviously this is a relatively small scale project, and we would need to investigate this further. But so far it seems to be the case that spectators' motivations have a strong impact on how they experience dance. And we've so far observed that there appear to be two sort of major types of motivation, if you like, in relation to the body. So there are some spectators who really want to be very physically aware in the performance, and they enjoy engaging with the performer's effort. So those kind of people like to see the dancers sweat. You know, there are some performances, I went to see one the other week where there were literally beads of sweat being sort of going up into the air, you know, sprayed onto the audience from the stage. Some people think that's fantastic, you know, and they love to hear the sounds of the dancers falling on the floor and hearing the breathing and all that sort of thing. And for them, that's really what, you know, the experience of watching dance is about. So that's like one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have a type of spectator who really wants to be transported. They want to have a kind of out-of-body experience. So they want sort of the music, you know, to sort of float them away. They want to see beautiful visual, you know, costumes and scenography, which will sort of whisk them into another world and allow them to sort of escape from where they actually are. And that is also a form of embodied experience, because it's very much using the senses. It's using all the senses working together. But the aim is more for people to go beyond where they are, rather than sort of being there, inhabiting their body in a very positive way. So this is, I think, very interesting in terms of it immediately relates to dance, but I think it's also interesting in a wider cultural context about the ways in which people relate to each other. And it would be interesting to look at that in terms of I think, sort of cultural coding and cultural values, and, you know, why people might be more motivated towards one or other type of response.
Well, another aspect of that would be of interest is that quality I mentioned when I did before I did the dance, I was empathized with, and it changed my energy level when I went into the dance the next day. So is there a way for the participant, the audience, to receive empathy, which is for them to be seen by others? Do you know what I mean? And what effect that would have would be something that's just a question that kind of came to me.
Right. So what do you mean by the audience being seen by others?
Well, when you have a performance, the actors or the dancers are there, and they are being seen by the audience. Yes. So right. And so their actions are being mirrored in the psyche or in the mirror neurons of the audience. Yes. Yes. So okay, the audience has a level of empathy of how much they have been seen and mirrored by others. And if you're all stressed and all worried, you know, and you're in the audience, and then you know you're going to have less attention, less openness to empathizing with the audience. I mean, with the performers. It's that when you've been empathized with yourself, I find it has an opening to it.
Yes, I see what you mean.
So if you can get the audience to all start empathizing with each other, like in our dance workshop, something we did is we have you know, a circle, and somebody steps into the circle and says their name, and they do a motion of how they're energetically feeling. Right, and then everybody steps into the center and mirrors them, and we go all the way around so that everybody's kind of been seen and reflected. So I don't know, it's just something for the future. And you were talking about a grant. You were talking about a grant. I actually have a grant in for doing this conference, online interviews and conference. So maybe that's something we can explore in the future too, doing more of these. So
yes. Along the lines of what we were talking about, one thing we didn't actually do a study on this, but it's something that we have done a bit, and you know, one of my PhD students has done some of it, which is to do movement workshops with audiences before they actually see anything. So when they see it, they have the impact of that. And one of my PhD students did a workshop like that in Manchester, and I went along. So we watched a film that's actually on our website, which is where Akram Khan is dancing. It's filmed by Rachel Davies, and the dancer is Akram Khan. And It's called Loose in Flight.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, we watched a bit of the film, and then Karen, my PhD student, showed us a sequence, and we learned that sequence, and then we watched the sequence again, having learned how to do it ourselves. And that was definitely different. You know, you definitely felt it was more embodied once you'd actually tried to do it yourself. So that's one of the things about the mirror neurons as well, that if something is actually in your motor repertoire, which is what the term they use to describe something that you know how to do yourself, you know how to do it and you have done it. So if it's in your own motor repertoire, your response to it is stronger than if it's not. But what our research showed was that even if it's not in your motor repertoire, even if it's not something that you are familiar with doing yourself, the fact of being familiar with seeing it makes a difference. So if you're not a ballet dancer, because we wanted to work with people who aren't dancers, because otherwise it wouldn't be clear whether the effect was because of their dance or because of their watching dance. So these were people who hadn't danced themselves, but who were familiar with watching. So people who are familiar with watching have a stronger response even if they don't know how to do it.
So there's like a whole spectrum of ways of intensifying the experience.
Yeah. Yes. But then an important aspect of that for us as well, for the qualitative research, is not only whether there's a quantitative difference in intensity of response, but whether that actually affects how people feel about it. Because, you know, someone might say to me, oh, your brain was terribly active when you were watching that. But if I wasn't interested in it, if I didn't experience anything positive, then that's not really relevant for a qualitative point of view. So we were also looking at whether kinesthetic response to something influences people's pleasure. Is that something that's important to them? And that does appear to be the case. You know, so many spectators say in different ways, you know, that something that they enjoy about dance has got to do with feeling that they are somehow involved. You know, they can experience the resonance, the motor resonance of the dance and the emotional effects.
Yeah. Well, this is a great topic here. I love this so much, this whole dance aspect, because I get so much pleasure and nurturance, you know, from the dance that I do.
That's great.
So we've kind of gone over your website and the project. What do you think about going through the book, some of the maybe an outline of the book?
Maybe just before that, I could just mention one thing about the website. There's on the main page of the first website you mentioned, the Watching Dance one, there's a list of links down the left-hand side, I think, and it says it mentions our interactive forum. So after the conference, we set up a Ning site. So as well as the Watching Dance, the main Watching Dance site, there's also this Ning site, which is an interactive one. And I'm really keen on this because since the conference, loads and loads of people have joined that site from all over the world. And it is an interactive site, which means people can post their own content if they have questions or topics that they want other people to discuss. And also I'll put up your conference if you send me the details of it when it's happening. I put up stuff there about things that are of interest to people who are on the site or who see the site. Because one of the things we discovered through the conference was that kinesthetic empathy is actually a topic that brings people together from so many different disciplines and also from so many different parts of the world. But because it's not a recognized topic as such, you know, if you say to someone, oh, I'm a historian or I'm a linguist or I'm a biologist, they know what you mean, but you can't really say you're a kinesthetic empathist because that doesn't exist as a concept. So that's why I feel it's really valuable to have this site as a way of sort of bringing together people who are interested in this concept.
So it brings people together. You can kind of keep the dialogue going.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that comes up if you Google just Watching Dance Ning, you get that that URL will come up and you can just get onto it that way.
Okay, yeah, I did show the website. I didn't see the link, but I did see all the side the links on the side. So it's one of those links then.
Yeah. Yeah, but just Googling Watching Dance Ning brings it up anyway. So.
Okay, Googling Dance Ning.
Yeah, Watching
Dance Ning. Okay. Okay, so then we've got the book, which you have a lot of contributors. So a lot of people have
Yes.
contributed. I've interviewed two of the people. You had Tal Shen, who did the music
Yes.
work,
Yes.
and Christian Keezers. I've interviewed them. In terms of the conference, it is already going on. It's an ongoing conference. And we've done about 130 interviews and panels so far. So it's and you're one of them. You're 131.
Great. Good.
So it's an ongoing project, and it's an indefinite conference. It's ever maybe like your name.
Yeah,
so,
yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah.
All on Skype and Google
Yes.
Hangouts.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have the book is Kinesthetic Empathy in Creative and Cultural Practices, and you and Matthew Reason are you kind of like the editors, or?
Yeah, we're the co-editors. Yeah.
Oh, co-editors. And it's broken down. Maybe you can just give an overview. I have the outline here, like different sections and.
Yeah, sure. I'll just get a drink of water.
Okay.
Right, yeah, so it's divided into different sections, which we wanted to be really sort of cross sections rather than by discipline. So, you know, there's a few people looking at film, for example, but we didn't want to put them all into the same section. We wanted it to be more topic based. So the first section is about empathy and social interactions. So the emphasis there is on kinesthetic empathy in social contexts through different forms. So there we've got theatre. That was Nicola Shocknessy. She's the person I mentioned earlier who's running the research centre at Kent, University of Canterbury in Kent. And Bonnie Meekums, who's the dance movement therapist that I'm doing the grant with now, putting the application in. And she was looking at kinesthetic empathy as a concept that is central to dance movement therapy. And then in that section also we had two psychologists, Amy Hayes and Stephen Tipper, and they were looking at the effects of different kinds of actions and what the effect of that motor resonance. So, for example, they were looking at fluent actions which have a flowing quality, and how those might affect people. What is the affective impact of those types of actions? So shall I carry on through different sections?
I have it up. Actually, I'm showing the outline. I had put the outline on my page here, so I'm actually seeing it. I have it up. Part 2, kinesthetic engagement, and if you want to continue.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So here we were looking at embodied responses and intersubjectivity. So how does the embodied aspect of kinesthetic empathy affect, like, the boundaries, the interactions between people, and also we were looking at cinema here. So the first the first chapter in that section was actually looking at cinematic empathy. So this is also about how people interact with screens and the embodied relationship with screens. And the musical interaction, which you mentioned earlier, is very much to do with the relationship between musicians. So this wasn't so much about people, audiences, but about people playing music together, how that what we call rhythmic entrainment or synchronization, how that affects the relationships between people. And I was also looking here at dance and the idea of the dancer's body. So it's not the body of the dancer or the body of the dancers, but the body of the dance. So it's the idea that there is this almost impersonal body that the dance forms through its movement. and that in responding to dance, we aren't so much responding to individuals or even to a collection of individuals, but we are responding to the body of the dance. And I was wanting here to try to get away from the idea of a sort of a straightforward emotional communication, if you like, because sometimes people talk about communicating through empathy as if it was something that could easily be defined. So, for example, I feel angry, so I shake my fist or something, and then people can see that I'm angry, and they might experience some of that anger, which is, of course, valid. But in art, I'm interested in how art is able to produce really very complex effects that can't be circumscribed by a label like that. So you may feel that you've seen something really powerful, but you may not be able to put a label on it. You may not be able to say, oh, the dance was expressing anger or the dance was expressing joy, because perhaps the dance actually brings together anger and joy in a way that wouldn't normally be the case. Perhaps the dance is doing something very unusual and something that breaks the mold of how we normally think. So in that sense, I want to be clear, and this is my own personal approach, that for me, empathy is more about an affect, which is not something that you can kind of label or circumscribe the same way that you can with an emotion.
And it's also like a multi-dimensional affect?
Yes, yes, bringing together different senses. So it's not something that is purely visual or purely movement or purely sound. It's something where everything works together. All the different senses work together.
It also reminds me of my dance instructor who kind of holds the dance space, Ava. She calls it the third body.
Ah, oh, that's very interesting.
Yeah, it's in the sense of it's not just you and me, but suddenly we become a third body.
Yeah.
That's a body of both of ours, or more.
Yes, that's right. And also this can encompass objects, because, I was saying how, empathy can be to do with objects rather than, it's not only people, and it can be the concrete environment, it can be a place. So it's something that it's not really about, for me, it's not really about relationships between circumscribed individuals. It's something that goes beyond that. And, it has got environmental implications as well.
Mm-hmm. We see ourselves as part of the environment and
Yeah. And one of the people who first started looking at empathy, the German philosopher Theodor Lipps, that's really what he was interested in. It was how people relate to objects and how they sort of experience objects to a kind of shared resonance or shared rhythm so that, for example, you can look at something, let's say you're looking at a line, and you might see the line as, if it's a wavy line, you might think it's winding, you might think it's moving, and you can kind of feel that windingness as you look at it. So you're experiencing a kind of shared movement between you and the line.
Yeah, once I talked to some folks who do kind of crystals. It was at one of these new age kind of things here in San Francisco, and they have all these crystals, and then the person brought up the crystal and said, listen to what it says to you. It speaks to you. And as the way they were talking, it was very much reminded me of the original use of the word empathy, the Einfühlung, the German. Is you feel your way into it, and the object kind of speaks to you. It says something to you in its shape and its form. So yeah, I think maybe that's a little bit too of what you're.
Yes, absolutely. But that's also a good example of where I think it's useful to distinguish between affect and emotion, because if you were to take that a step further and say, the crystal told me X, then I would think, oh, that's taking things a bit too far. But when it's more about the affective properties of the crystal, that's something that I feel is more, it's it's more embodied. It's not trying to put a label or being too didactic about what's actually going on.
Yeah, just the experience.
Yeah.
What is the sensations you're
Yeah.
having as you look at this
Exactly.
object?
Yes. Yes. And recognizing also that that will come largely from ourselves. You know, as I said before, spectators very much bring their own motivations to things, and what we see does depend to a certain extent on what kinds of things we're looking for and what we want to see and what our previous experience is. So, for example, you know, one of the people that we interviewed with the dance is a lighting designer. That's his training, and the lighting of the piece really impacts on him in a way that it doesn't impact on me, because I don't have that same awareness of lighting that he does.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Okay. Then we had part 3, kinesthetic impact.
Yeah, kinesthetic impact, performance and embodied engagement. So this is really, this section is really looking at how one actually performs empathy. So it's like a deliberate construct. When people make something, when they perform in a particular way, they know they're going to be looked at. You know, you were talking earlier about the performers being watched by the audience, and when the performers go out on stage, they know that they are going to be looked at. So they are kind of, they are shaping in a way. Their performance is shaping our experience of empathy. So it's looking at how the performers do that. So with Charlie Chaplin, the first chapter there is looking at how Charlie Chaplin as performer, how he performs kinesthesia, how he sort of provokes our reactions by this very clever way that he has of moving and sort of constructing in a way how we respond to him. So there's this lovely example of a moment where he has ice cream sliding down the inside of his trousers and he's squirming, and how that makes people feel when they watch it. But of course that's different from how it would be if you were actually if you were in a situation where it actually went down your trousers, and you but when you're performing it in order to provoke a response in people, you perform it in a very particular way. It's constructed and crafted. And also in relation, there's a chapter in this section on film. So this is also looking at how the performance in film is constructed, and this is very much about the actual acting element in the film, and how the actor and the film, the camera, are constructing again the spectator's experience of them.
So the camera is almost like a person and viewpoint. It's kind of, how are you empathizing with the camera's movement? And
exactly, yeah. So how does the camera show us something? How does it shape our empathy through the way that it moves, that sort of thing. And in the last chapter in that section, it's really looking at the ethical aspect of empathy, and also as a part of that, what the limitations of empathy are, so that we have to respect also the otherness of the other, and you know, respect what is possible to empathize with and what isn't, and that itself is in itself empathetic. You know, rather than
empathizing with people's boundaries, like you don't want to overwhelm them and be kind of know what they're feeling.
Well, yes, I mean that comes up in another place as well, in the chapter by Bonnie Meekums on dance movement therapy, where she says, you know, people actually need space, as well as you know, too much empathy would be overwhelming. You know, we can't sort of do too much empathy, so it's also about having those spaces and respecting distance. But here it's also about kind of experiences where we know we can't actually, which are beyond our ken, as it were. There are certain things where we have to be aware that the other person. So it's about being aware and respecting really the difference of the other person, and that's part of empathy. It's not all about sort of sameness, as it were, or assimilating other people to ourselves. It's also about respecting otherness. And then the next section is particularly about the concept of stillness, and how stillness in itself can be a motive for empathy. So the first chapter here is by a performance artist, and she's talking about her own practice. So in this section as well, there's an emphasis on people who are themselves artists and presenting their work, and how they explore stillness through their work, and how the audience can actually empathize through stillness as well as through movement. So it's not simply about, it's not about sort of quantity of movement in a way, because sometimes cognitive scientists in particular, that it's very much about looking at what you can measure. So often they are looking at sort of the amount of movement that might be going on. But here it's very much about, well, what happens when there isn't a lot of movement going on? What happens then to the empathy? How does it work? So that's being explored, particularly in the first chapter. And then in the section on the next chapter on scenography, this is very much looking at the kind of the multi-sensory environment and the idea of immersion, that what happens when the audience is experiencing the performance through different senses and are sort of immersed in a sensory experience.
Chapter 11, Empathy and Exchange, Audience Experience of Scenography.
Yeah, yes. So there again, this is looking at empathy, not so much about sort of between individuals, but actually empathy here with the stage environment and how that affects people's response. And then there's a chapter on photography, which is by my co-editor Matthew Reason, and this is like a dialogue between him and the photographer Chris Nash. Chris Nash is the photographer who did the picture that's on the front cover of the book, and he is a very highly respected dance photographer worldwide, really, and certainly the most eminent in the UK. And he was really interested in using photography to explore what kinesthetic empathy is. So it's not really about showing something very spectacular in dance that can, try to make the viewer feel as if they're seeing the dance through the photograph. It's not about that. It's about exploring the process of kinesthetic empathy and using photography as a way of exploring that in a way which isn't directly translatable into words. So again, this is coming back to the idea that that kinesthetic empathy is not always something that you can explain in verbal form, and sometimes you need other media to explore it in. Then obviously words are our most, the way that we communicate most. But once we have another medium, so like once we have the photographs, we can then talk about the photographs, we can talk about what's going on through the photographs. And then the final section is really looking at technology, and particularly digital technology. So one of the things that's interesting here is how can technology actually sort of expand and extend our experience of kinesthetic empathy? Because if we think of technology as giving us the possibility of sort of extending what the body can do and extending the way that we can interact with each other, like, for example, the way that we're interacting now, because, hundreds of years ago, we wouldn't have been able to communicate at all.
Yeah.
Then, more recently, we've been able to communicate through, telephones. But now we can actually see each other, and we can sort of feel that we're inhabiting the same space without actually inhabiting the same space. And I think it's interesting that this is partly a personal thing. I think we're so used to being connected digitally. I'm going away on holiday next week and I won't have any internet. And to me, that's going to feel really strange, because it feels like some part of me that's normally working will not be working when I get out of the sort of signal area. So it's almost as if I feel like I've internalized that kind of connectedness that we have through the internet. But in fact, I haven't really internalized it, because take away electricity, like all it takes is a power cut and it's gone. And when I go to a different place, it isn't there. But the technology really does bring up this issue about different ways of connecting. So the first chapter here is looking at the work of a particular choreographer who is trained in Skinner release technique, but also uses digital technologies to make dance and to make performance pieces using dance. And it's really looking at how those different sort of interfaces give us new ways of interacting with and responding to moving bodies. How can the digital technology enable us to be more connected? How can it enable us to have a richer sensory experience?
I have just something I saw that might be of interest. You were talking about that we're kind of connecting here, looking at each other through the screen. There's something I just saw called the mirror box. Is that you put this kind of cone over two people and they face each other, kind of like we're facing each other. But what it does is it takes half your image and half mine and merges the two. So when I see you, I see myself, kind of half myself in you.
Gosh.
And it's like it totally freaks people out, and it kind of totally changes your whole sense of who you are.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Yeah.
It's called the mirror box, and it was some student in Los Angeles, and did a bunch of stuff with it. It looks really interesting.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because that's that reminds me of the the phantom limb phenomenon, where they have and how if you give people who have the phantom limb experience, if you sort of give them a visual image of the limb that they have lost, they can actually interact with that visual image as if it was theirs. So I think all this really is about how fluid the boundaries are between what really is us and what is something else or somebody else, and how can we use creatively that fluidity. How can we use it creatively to make art, but also how can we use it creatively to further interactions between people, to give us a different kind of awareness of how we relate to each other and how we relate to the environment.
Yeah, I just saw an experiment too where they had someone lay down on a kind of on a couch, a bed, and then they put on a mask. I mean, a head cover and they can see their legs and body in front of them. But what they've really done is they have another mirror dummy of the person. So it's not your legs that are really there. Yes. It's the dummy. I don't know if you've seen that. And then they go and then they stroke the leg of the dummy and your leg at the same time. So you feel like it's happening to both. It's you. You start thinking that picture that I'm seeing is actually me. And then they bring out a knife. And then they then they want to stab the dummy's leg, and you think, "Oh my God, it's mine!" And when they stab it, you feel the pain.
Yes, I'd heard the first part of that, but I hadn't heard the knife bit. Maybe that's if they added on more recently. That sounds scary, but yeah, absolutely. That illustrates the point perfectly. So there is this fluidity of boundaries. Yeah.
Okay.
So then, and then there's a chapter about multimedia performance.
For team, interactive multimedia performance and the audience's experience of kinesthetic empathy. Yeah.
So here again, this is really looking at how how using multimedia and involving the audience's senses rather than just their visual sense. How can that intensify? Does it intensify their involvement, and how does it intensify their involvement? And that's what Brian, who made this piece, was really interested in in exploring. You know, if he made the piece in such a way that heightened sensory experience and heightened audiences' involvement through the senses, would that then intensify their experience of Hello?
Oh, hi. It looks like we just had a little
Sorry, we
glitch.
seem to get cut off there, yeah.
I'm going to turn my video off so there's more bandwidth. You won't see me, but yeah. So you were just talking about the, let's see, it was number 14.
Yes, interactive multimedia performance and the audience's experience of kinesthetic empathy. So again, this is using technology to intensify sensory experience and looking at how this impacts on the audience's kinesthetic engagement with the performance. And then the last chapter on kinesthetic empathy interaction. This is about designing interactive sports equipment. And this is really about how playing sports requires kinesthetic skill and awareness. So, for example, you have to be able to anticipate what your opponent is going to do next. You have to be in tune with their body to know what they're doing, to almost like if you can kind of put yourself in their shoes, as it were, you can sort of anticipate better what they're about to do. And so there are certain kinds of sports equipment which are discussed in this chapter, digitally designed equipment, which are intended to improve those kinds of skills. So it's a different sort of approach really to training sports people through kinesthetic empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So this, I think, is also of interest outside of the area of sports, because it raises this question we were talking about earlier about whether kinesthetic empathy is something that can be changed. Is it open to intervention? Can people become more skilled in kinesthetic empathy?
Yeah, so we can have kind of like an empathy gym or something.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, isn't all empathy in a sense kinesthetic, in the sense that, we're really kind of mirroring the other person, auditorially or physically or.
Well, yes, I think you could argue that there is that basis there, but sometimes it can be a lot more abstract than that if there isn't any direct physical connection. I mean, one could talk, for example, about empathizing with, a character that you read about in a novel, and you may not have any sort of physical information about them. So I think it can be more or less embodied, but I would agree that I think if you experience an empathic reaction, there is always going to be a certain physical basis to it, but it's a question of how strong that is, really. It can be, and some people take a more cognitive approach to empathy, where they talk about perspective taking. So it's like something where you might, for example, decide that you agree with the point of view of a particular politician, and therefore you sort of adopt their perspective on a particular issue. That's like a more cognitive approach to empathy.
I see. That's more the perspective taking. I see. You're making that distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. This is such a fascinating topic, and you've explored it to such a degree and been such early pioneers in exploring this from the arts and sciences together. I could go into a lot more. I don't know how much time you have, because we've gone for about an hour and 10 minutes. I don't want to keep you over.
No, it's okay. Well, okay. I'm sure we need to finish up, but I'll just say something quickly about the arts and science, because I do think that's really important. I think it's something that has become, how to put it, extremely active over the last year or two. There is an immense amount of work going on. I do think that we were among the first to start this off. I'm not saying that we started everybody off, it's just that it sort of happened. These things tend to happen around the same time. And I think it's very important because I think there's a growing awareness that, that we do need to put these different kinds of knowledge together. And they aren't always going to map onto each other perfectly. There are going to be conflicts and there are going to be different values. And sometimes people are going to be looking for different things. So it's not a question of saying that, you know, it's a kind of a perfect happy ending and that everything fits exactly. But I think even with the conflicts and the difficulties that exist, it's really important to pursue these different areas together, because otherwise we're not going to get, you know, we're going to get a distorted picture. We're only going to get sort of half-truths and bits of things, and it's a lot more exciting and productive to be, I think, brave about it and to confront what may be the inadequacies on each side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have, this is kind of coming into the, let me turn my video on so maybe it'll work now so you can see. But it's like, it's kind of looking at what the definition of empathy is for me, in the sense that, I mean, I have my definition that I've kind of, you know, I've talked to a lot of people and been trying to kind of merge these different definitions. Yeah. So I see kind of 4 parts to empathy. And the first part is what I would call self-empathy. So it's the sensory awareness of what's going on inside of myself. Mm-hmm. And as I kind of get more grounded in my own awareness and connected, you know, grounded, centered, whatever you want to call it, that it kind of, and there's less anxiety and fear or what have you, I kind of open up and am able to have awareness for what's going on outside more. And that creates a space for a mirrored empathy through mirror neurons. So as you shake your hand or I'm moving my hand, you're kind of mirroring what's going on. And then so that's kind of the mirrored empathy, sometimes called emotional empathy. Yeah. or affective empathy, you know, by the scientists. And it's pretty much based on the mirror neuron component. And then there's the third part, which I call imaginative empathy, or it's also the perspective taking or cognitive empathy. And then we're moving in towards more of the academic and sciences, really into the perspective taking, whereas the artists tend to really focus maybe on that mirroring experiential experience. And then the fourth part of empathy is the what I call empathic action, is that as we kind of connect with each other and see our common humanity and that have that sense of the third body, you know, which my dance, you know, Ava talks about, that we naturally want to contribute to the well-being of others and kind of work together and in kind of a harmonious, you know, contributing way. And so that's kind of the empathic action. And I kind of see it as the wheel of empathy. So it's more, it's not that, you know, one necessarily, they all interact and so forth. And it's kind of like a dynamic energy. So as we can create deeper and deeper empathy, you know, we kind of connect more deeply to each other and we can kind of act more deeply. And, you know, there's the empathic action part I've seen a lot in mediation, where people are very, you know, mad at each other and they're in conflict. And then the mediation processes that I've done, it's all about the facilitators empathizing with both sides, letting them feel heard, letting them be seen, letting them kind of see themselves reflected in the mediator. Then the mediator will turn the disputants to each other and kind of facilitate a mirroring. I'm starting to go deeper and deeper and see where the other's humanity is and what's kind of going on with them. And then the last part is that empathic action. You say, okay, you've made some kind of connection. What do we do now? and they'll start negotiating, holding the other person's humanity, each other's, and they start kind of negotiating and working together towards kind of creating a solution to the problem or how they will go forward. So these dynamics all kind of interact, but that's kind of the basic framework so far, my operating understanding. And if I'm hearing it correctly, your kinesthetic empathy is maybe geared towards the mirroring part, that mirror neurons, the reflecting part, that maybe a bit more.
Yeah, probably. I suppose it's also it does also concern, like I was saying before, the material environment, as well as people. It's about that kind of openness to that sort of sensory experiences, as well as to other people as individuals. And I think an aspect that came to mind when you were talking about the action part is also to be aware of the possible negative uses of empathy, which we've just mentioned in the conclusion of the book. In other words, for example, you talk about creating a feeling of togetherness, and it's also about being aware of not wanting to make that exclusionary. So it's not us together over here as opposed to you lot over there. So I think that's an important part of there are important aspects of empathy that can, as it were, go wrong. It's a quick flip, as it were, from one side to another. So in terms of kind of individual relationships and the ethics that I was saying earlier about being aware of difference, rather than, for instance, like assuming that other people are similar to me. So I meet somebody from a different culture or a different gender or a different part of, different social background or something, rather than just assuming, we are the same, we have sort of automatic empathy. I think it's really important to build in the awareness of difference. And similarly, with groups, I think it's important to be aware of that possibility that empathy can be used in the wrong way. So there are examples in history of how, for example, entrainment, rhythmic entrainment, think of Hitler and how he used mass spectacle and rhythm, yes, to produce a sense of togetherness, but, for really bad reasons, really bad motives. So it's important to be aware of the possible misuses as well. I think, empathy is really, really powerful, but we have to be aware of the whole ramifications of that, really.
Yeah. So it's that the empathy can create kind of like an in-group, and within the group there might be connection, and then you've got kind of the out-group. And for me, that's what I call the culture of empathy, is really everybody empathizing with everybody, and there's no in and out group. So that for me, that's the term I use for a culture of empathy. And if you have an out group, it's not that empathy is the problem in the out group. It's a lack of empathy, right? It's the narrowing of empathy to a select group. So the problem itself, to me at least, is not that empathy is the problem. The problem is that empathy hasn't been extended widely enough.
But in the case of that, it could be to do with needing to be more culturally aware of what the other person's or the other group's behavior means, or not making assumptions about different groups. So I think it's not necessarily. I think it does require a certain. I was talking earlier about baggage that people come with, their own personal baggage, but people also have cultural baggage, and sometimes we need to actually know a little bit about what that baggage might be, so that the embodied empathy, which kinesthetic empathy is obviously primarily embodied, but even when it's embodied, the body itself can be very culturally constructed, you know, the behavior of the body, so that sometimes we need some knowledge and perhaps even direct experience of other people's embodied culture, as it were, or other people's cultured embodiment in order for that empathy to happen.
And maybe that inhibition that you're talking, not inhibition, but the block to empathy, there is judgments that people tend to judge each other, like, oh, you're stupid, or you're brilliant, or your culture is,
maybe even misinterpreting other people's responses as aggressive, perhaps when that wasn't what they, you know, that wasn't how they meant their behavior to be perceived. But then we also have to recognize that sometimes there is aggression and sometimes there is something that needs to be dealt with. So, yeah, so I think there's a lot of negotiating also that needs to go on.
Yeah, and a lot of exploration. So I'm so thrilled to have connected with you and heard about your project, heard about your website, your conference, your book, and that you're going to be continuing this exploration, because I'm totally dedicated to it as well. So I feel that, you know, we can kind of continue along this path and see.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, I'm really excited by what you're doing. So I want to find out more about that and keep in touch, and we can link through our websites.
Okay, great. Then it's been wonderful talking to you, and I'll send you some emails, information about the site, and we'll see what we can do next.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Right, well, it's my time here, but I can say have a good day to you, because it's early there.
It's kind of dark there. Yeah, I see. Okay, bye, Dee.
It's getting very dark. Okay, bye.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.